Should I go on button? Talk? We'll go on button. It's usually what I do, I think.
Zank Films.
Subscribe.
Hello and welcome to the Retrospective review. Gojira has been a pop culture icon since this film's first release back in 1954, soon after the end of the Second World War. I have been a massive fan of this franchise for years, and when I first saw this film about 3 years ago, I absolutely loved it. It might have had some cheesy effects, but I still thought that it was an absolute masterpiece. Without further ado, this is the original Gojira. This film follows a member of the Japanese Coast Guard, Ogata, as ships start mysteriously disappearing at sea. And as it turns out, it is all the result of a prehistoric monster, Gojira, standing at almost 165 meters tall. After some investigation, it turns out that the monster was actually caused by nuclear weapon testing, and the entire rest of the film is all about various moral questions like whether or not it's even right to kill this monster in the first place, or whether or not the weapon that they do end up using to kill him should be revealed to the world. I really love the story of this film, and I also surprisingly love the romantic side plot with Ogata and Himiko. Unlike most giant monster movies, especially now, this film really handles the human drama, the political and the romantic very, very well. You actually care about these characters, their stories, their dramas, and their hardships throughout the film, rather than just sitting there waiting and biding time for the giant monster to show up. You can really get into the story and the emotion of this film beyond just the giant monster fights and the big epic destruction scenes, though it also has plenty of that. There is so much characterization in this film, especially through the smaller little details, and especially for Serizawa. Things like slowly seeing him fill his house with fish tanks, constantly reminding himself of what his invention has done and what it is capable of doing, along with him constantly looking very scruffy and unkempt, especially the eye patch, which on its own is a really cool costume design. In fact, everything about his costume design is really cool in this film. He looks incredibly badass, serious, and intense. But the eye patch also represents something much deeper for his character. It gives a very obvious physical representation of the sort of horrible things that he experienced and saw in World War II. He has experienced weapons of mass destruction firsthand and truly understands on a much deeper level than most people the level of torment and destruction that they can cause. And because of that understanding, he understands the ramifications of his own invention so much more than anyone else could. His invention, if you don't know, being a bomb that actually destroys all of the oxygen within any given amount of water, instantly eradicating all life within that water. Even just a small amount of it could turn Tokyo Bay into a complete wasteland. And because of all of this, he is psychologically destroyed by the indecision of whether or not to use his bomb to kill Gojira. As much as he wants to help people and stop that giant monster, he also knows full well that once his weapon is revealed to the world, he would be adding yet another terrible weapon of mass destruction to humanity's arsenal. He's even willing to take his own life in order to keep the bomb from getting into the wrong hands. And when he eventually tells Himiko, who he effectively sees as his own sister, his plans to destroy the bomb and kill himself in order to keep it out of the wrong hands, it completely destroys her. When he first shows Himiko the oxygen bomb, it looks like a scene straight out of Frankenstein. He appears as a mad scientist tortured by the indecision of using his weapon and of even showing her his weapon. And when he does show her, the absolute horror and terror that she feels, and as she clearly shows, just perfectly demonstrates how terrible and destructive this weapon really is. Himiko and Ogata's romantic side plot is surprisingly really good. It's really impressive how interesting and dramatic the romance in a Gojira film can actually be. And as Serizawa wishes them luck and happiness together in the future, when he is about to kill himself is so incredibly powerful and dramatic. It is genuinely heartbreaking. Getting all that human drama right is something that I really don't think any other Gojira film since, except for Shin Gojira, has actually done properly, and it's something that a lot of giant monster movies and a lot of action movies and a lot of movies in general could really do a far better job at today. On that same note, the professor, Yumiko's father, who is a marine biologist, throughout the entire film slowly becomes more and more depressed at the fact that the entire country simply wants to kill Gojira, where he would prefer that he be studied and researched. When he's originally introduced, he's very sloppy. His shirt's untucked, his tie is undone, and he looks like he hasn't slept in days. And throughout the film, he is shown brooding several times. All of this really puts even his daughter on edge, to a point where he completely explodes at Ogato when he suggests that they ought to kill Gojira. Though I will say that whole moral issue of whether or not to kill the monster is kind of dropped about halfway through after the Tokyo battle. Though it could also be that after watching firsthand the amount of destruction and death that Gojira can bring, the professor actually changed his mind about wanting to keep the animal alive. Now, Gojira himself is one of the biggest characters in this film. Huh? Big? It's a pun. The entire film is a very slow build-up to finally revealing him. It starts off with just simply suggesting raw power to eventually showing up as an actual tangible creature where we only really see the top of his head, and it is completely terrifying. All of that leading to his massive attacks on 2 cities in Japan, where he completely leaves nothing but destruction and death in his trail. And those attack scenes on the land in the cities are absolutely incredible. It showcases some of the most beautiful effects and cinematic techniques I have ever seen in order to create some of the most powerful and intense moments in cinema history. Like when we see a mother holding her children lying in the street who are crying as she slowly whispers to them, "Don't worry, we'll be where daddy is soon." And I also love that Gojira is given both a spiritual and scientific explanation in this film. The spiritual comes from the native islanders and their traditions, and the scientific comes from the professor and Ogato's investigations. It really helps this film have a sense of both traditionalism and modernism in a way that feels very reminiscent to how Japan's culture is today, a mix of traditionalism and modernism. I think that judging the special effects in a film from 1950s Japan by the standards of today would be rather stupid. That said, this film has a lot of special effects that even today still hold up and really create some terrifying imagery. They use some really awesome and incredible effects beyond just the famous man in a suit, including puppetry and one of my personal favorites, rear screen projection. Rear screen projection is a technique in which you first film a subject like Gojira. You would film him in his suit walking about a miniature city set. You would then build a life-size set of a city with a bunch of actors running around on it, whilst projecting that film of Gojira walking about behind it to create the illusion on camera that monster is actually walking around on those people. It was used a lot in Interstellar and in the Terminator films, and even in this film from almost 70 years ago, it still looks really, really great. And speaking of the suit, that suit was not made out of rubber like most people think. It was actually made from a mix of concretes. That mix of concrete created an incredibly heavy and hot suit for Haru Nakajima to wear and act in, and he did an incredible job in this film, and he does not get nearly enough recognition as he should for his role as Gojira. One of the best ways that they conceal some of the effects to make it look a lot more gritty and real is by setting the 2 city attack scenes at night. Especially with the old black and white film, it really makes everything a lot darker, and it makes it a lot more difficult to notice some of the rear screen projection and puppetry work at play. As well as using lots of fog, it makes a lot of the wide shots and even some of the close-ups of the monster look incredible. incredible and look real. So a lot of those effects still look incredible today, especially the fire is one of the coolest looking aspects of this film. Though it can be very difficult to overlook sometimes, like when the fighter jets start attacking him after Tokyo and when some of those fire trucks are crashing during the Tokyo scene. As well, in the editing, it has a lot of really awkward jump cuts, which are likely caused by having a lack of film on set. And though they do help give the film a little bit of charm, it can be very distracting at times, and it could also have been so easily fixed by simply using an insert shot or only using half of one of the cuts. And I think the cinematic style of this film, that being the style of most films of that era, of mostly wide shots and rather boring angles, though it can be a little bit lame, it does give the film a lot of charm, character, and I think it makes it a lot better than it would be if it were using modern cinematography. I think it really wouldn't have had a lot of the same effect or impact that it does. This soundtrack is absolutely brilliant. Firstly, the military theme is one of the most iconic songs from this film. It's very bombastic and orchestral, and it feels like the kind of song that you would hear during a parade. It's an absolute perfect fit for this movie, and for the somewhat corny style of it. Now the monster's theme itself is a lot less iconic, but it is absolutely incredible. It's very intense and terrifying along with the visuals, and the massive horns make it sound almost like his very footsteps. The whole thing sounds like the kind of music that you would hear whilst walking into hell. Arguably the most powerful song from this film is the Prayer for Peace. It is so incredibly moving and emotionally deep. It brings me to tears nearly every time I hear it. The entire scene it's used in is so important and deep. It really helps hammer in the messaging of this film. Firstly, the song itself is being sung by small schoolgirls who are probably no older than 10. And the visuals that it is showing alongside that are some of the most incredibly powerful in the film, showing the aftermath of the Tokyo attack scene, a lot of it looking like a war zone, looking as if an atomic bomb was dropped on the city. This song and this moment takes the film to an entirely new emotional level, and without it, the entire film simply would not work. It would not have the same message or the same cultural impact. The sound effects in this film are also incredible. The monster himself sounds like pure terror. His footsteps and especially his ear-shattering roar. And how exactly would one go about creating this centuries-old, horrifying sound? By rubbing some balloons on a violin. But even the way the audio is recorded, I absolutely love the sound of old microphones. It just gets a more organic feeling that you can't get with digital mics, making it sound more real and organic and human. Ashiro Honda is a director that knows no subtlety. The metaphor of this film is so incredibly on the nose. It's incredibly obvious what he's trying to say with this film. That metaphor, of course, being the metaphor of the monster for a nuclear bomb, especially the nuclear bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But this film is about more than just nuclear bombs, and it's definitely more than just an anti-nuclear propaganda piece. It's much deeper and more significant than that. This film comes from Japan almost almost immediately after World War II and the tragedies of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It is about all weapons of mass destruction in all forms, all of the danger and the destruction and the heartbreak that it will cause, the complete and utter torment and destruction, not just from the initial attack, but to the greater nation and culture. And of course, this theme is constantly suggested throughout the film, even to a point where one woman directly compares the monster to the atomic bombs, and at the very end when the professor outright states it.
あのゴジラが最後の一匹だとは思えない。もし水爆実験が続けて行われるとしたら、あのゴジラの同類がまた世界のどこかへ現れてくるかもしれない。
However, it's also about something else. As throughout the film, Serizawa is tormented by the decision of whether or not to use his oxygen bomb to kill Gojira. It helps suggest that weapons like that can also be used and also need to be used for good purposes, for the protection and preservation of human life. The tragedies of Nagasaki and Hiroshima are immense and horrible. The purpose behind them was, of course, to end World War II, as it did, ultimately ending the most deadly and horrific war in human history. So this film does bring in and discuss the both sides of that sort of issue, and presenting it as something a lot more complicated than just nukes bad. There's a lot more to it and a lot more depth involved in this story and in the actual question itself. Of course, the version of this film originally released in the United States in 1954 completely negates all of that. It was so edited and censored and cut, it gets to a point where it is an entirely different film, and one that completely negates and completely destroys the original meaning and purpose behind this original masterpiece. In fact, the censoring and editing down that happened with this film is a lot like the censoring and editing down that happens nowadays with American films trying to appeal to the Chinese audience. Yeah, the Black Panther poster thing is... yeah. Since this film's release in 1954, Gojira has become one of the biggest pop culture icons in human history, being a part of some of the biggest blockbuster films ever made, being at the absolute top of the box office countless times in a row. It has absolutely been cemented into international pop culture, but especially Japanese and American culture. However, this film itself is not being talked about nearly as much as it ought to. It's like all of this film's much deeper meanings has been completely forgotten by most people, who just pass it off because of cheesy effects and corny acting. And so people just pass it off as another one of the cheesy Gojira films, like all of its sequels, and absolutely ignore the complete cinematic masterpiece that is Gojira 1954. Thank you all for watching this installment of the Retrospective review. If you enjoyed, please leave a like, comment, maybe even subscribe. Thank you all again for watching, and have a nice day. What was that? Was that a funny outro? Was that funny?